Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little. I'm here today with the homework challenge. We're not in October, we're in November. For November 2019, I hope you are all having a fantastic day. Toby says, the first time you've seen this live. Well, here we are, good. Louis Philippe said he's sitting in a pool, first in the bounty hunter tournament with 20 left. Well, good job, good work. All right, let's go ahead and get to today's homework challenge. This was a tough one. I know it gave some of you problems, and hey, that's okay. That's what we're going for, because if all these were easy, well, I guess you wouldn't need me, right? So, in a 2-5 cash game against competent opponents with 100 big blind stacks, everyone folds to you in the hijack seat. What is your strategy? All right, you should already start being a little bit tight, but okay. Suppose you raise to 15, only the button calls. Flop comes queen, jack, 8. What should we do? Suppose it goes check, check, turns a 5. What do we do? Suppose it goes check, check, river is an 8. What do we do? This is a question that you all answered in varying ways. Some of you were way too loose. Some of you were way too tight. Some of you had too many bluffs. Some of you didn't have enough bluffs. You were all over the place. And that's because that's what happens whenever your ranges get a little bit funky by the river. So let's just take a look at two different answers that I think are both fine and reasonable. And to be fair, the GTO strategy is actually in the middle of the two. So let's take a look at this. Here we have the pre-flop range. Nothing too fancy here. You can be a little bit looser, a little bit tighter, depending on how you expect your opponents to play. I don't think it's that big of a deal. This is roughly the GTO range. You could be a little bit looser with small pairs, maybe a few more suited connected type hands. Maybe like ace-9 offsuit if you know your opponents are really tight. Jack-10 offsuit if you think they're really tight. But you really don't want to be going much wider than this from the hijack seat, just because it's relatively easy for someone yet to act to wake up with a hand. So be aware of that. On the flop comes queen, jack, 8. So you raise, only the button calls, flop comes queen, jack, 8. What is your strategy? Well, let's just take a look at the natural breakdown here, right? As you see, if we broke it down like this, it works out okay, right? We have 1.5 to 1 draws to premium made hands, which is fine. We have roughly 70% marginal made, 30% junk. That's fine. I think this strategy here is perfectly viable, perfectly reasonable. If you said something like this, I have no problem with it. As you see, premium made hands are ace, queen, and better, right? That makes logical sense. Draws are gut shots and open-ended straight draws and backdoor flush draws with an overcard, right? That makes logical sense. Marginal made hands that can check call include all 8s and better. Again, makes logical sense. Notice that range is somewhat protected by having some queens in it. And then junk is pocket 7s and lower and king 7. And then these ace highs without backdoor flush draw. I think that all seems reasonable. But I'm not so sure this is what you should exactly do. Notice this strategy has you betting about 50% of the time and checking 50% of the time. And to be fair, this really is what I'm doing against most players. If I'm against a very strong opponent, though, there's something important to recognize, and that is that we do not have the range or the nut advantage in this scenario. We just don't, depending on how wide we are opening. So I gave a slightly looser pre-flop range here. I had pocket 2s and better, but you see all these other hands are in this. So this is our range with about 49% equity against our opponent's range, which I just inputted the roughly implementable GTO strategy. You can find these on the 6 max cash game charts that we have. Those should be available for you in the tool section. And you see, it's roughly 50-50. And if you tinker with these ranges a little bit one way or the other, it's still going to be roughly 50-50. And when it's roughly 50-50, that's going to result in you doing more checking on average. So you should be checking more than this most likely. And that's just because if you do look at the marginal made hands, sure, a queen can call down no problem. But can a jack really check call flop, check call turn, check call river? I mean, it's kind of dicey, right? So you probably would prefer to strengthen your checking range by checking more premium made hands like ace queen. But if you did that, what's going to happen? Well, now we need to maybe bet fewer draws depending on the strategy. If we bet fewer draws, now we end up with more junk, and it starts to get a little bit odd. Isn't that almost 2-to-1 marginal made to junk? Yes, so you typically want, at most, 2 draws to 1 premium made hand, which here we have 1.5 to 1, which is fine. But then you want about 70% marginal made to 30% junk. It's got the calculator just to confirm that's correct. So here we have 35 divided by 50. So here we have right at 70%, right? So this is a fine ratio. This ratio essentially makes it to where you can easily check call, folding out about 30% of your range on each betting round, as long as your medium strength marginal made hands are pretty decent. And here our medium strength marginal made hands are like ace jack and king jack and queen jack, and those are pretty decent. So if you do check with a hand like jack 10 here, the plan is often to not fold against a competent player. Anyway, this is roughly my default strategy. I don't really have a problem with this. So let's say, is ace king a marginal made hand? Kind of. Ask yourself, Toby, can ace king check call the flop confidently and then continue on some turns? And the answer is sometimes. I think you'd probably rather just use it as a bluff, but no, it's certainly a scenario where you could check it. The problem is that ace king on like queen jack blank is way worse than ace king on queen 7-3, right? Because on queen jack blank, there's just way more hands in your opponent's range that beat you. Basically, your marginal made hands, you want to be asking, is this hand likely good? And like ace king, it's not likely good in this scenario. Well, you know what we can do? We can pull up Equilab real quick. And what you can do is you can see how much equity a hand like ace king has, because I don't actually know the right answer to it. So let's see. Anytime you don't know the answer, look it up. Don't just guess. Let's give our opponent again. Let's go back over here and give this same range, which was 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 5s, 4s, ace, queen offsuit, bunch of suited connected hands. I'm entering it on the other screen, don't worry. I actually am doing it. All right, I think I've entered it. Okay, now we have ace king. Now we have the board of queen of hearts, jack of clubs, 8 of diamonds. And you see, well, ace king has 50%. Not so bad. That's presuming the opponent bets everything, though. Do you think the opponent's going to bet with everything on this board? Why aren't we giving him pocket 6s? Is that on the implementable chart? No, it's not, actually. Because sometimes 6s, 5s, 4s are all 3 bets. So will our opponent bet those? Probably not. Will they bet jacks? Probably not. Will they bet 10s and 9s and 8s? Probably not. Will they bet these? Probably not. They may bet some of these. I don't know. It's tough to say. If they're betting all their ace X, you see we're in great shape. Obviously, we start missing draws if they're not betting all these. If they're betting these, you see we're in pretty rough shape. So anyway, this is a scenario where ace king could check call. Sure. Notice if you check call ace king, though, what does that do to your range? And so, Toby, very often the question is not necessarily isn't ace king a marginal made hand. It's more of a question of, if it is a marginal made hand, what does that do to the rest of our range? Do we need more marginal made hands? No, we don't need more marginal made hands. Do we need more draws? Yes, we do need more draws. So you should look for more draws. And where are the obvious draws? I mean, find a more obvious draw than this hand, right? All right. Seven, 6 suited, backdoor, straight, and flush draw. It's not a particularly good draw. That's actually like a really bad draw. 9-7 if you have it. We don't have 9-7 suited. It's white, right? All right, so say it does go check, check. Fine. Now on the turn, turn's a 5. What is our strategy? So once the turn checks, the opponent's range gets much weaker because now the opponent's range no longer includes hands like probably pocket 8s and ace queen and king queen and queen jack, right? So now our queens get way better to the point that they can pretty confidently value bet turn and river. Also, when it does go check, check, sometimes your opponent's going to have a hand with plenty of equity, like jack 10, that you want to extract value from. So you're going to find that the best marginal made hands in your range often go up in value, right? So in this scenario, should we have a betting range? And the answer is definitely yes. Do we have some draws, right? Well, not a ton, right? So given we don't actually have a ton of draws, we kind of have to search for them to some extent. And in this scenario, I elected to use 7/6s, 7/6 suited, and King 7 of spades. King 7 is a king high. 7/6 is straight draw. I see it's gray. I messed up when I was entering this. So we would have a few more draws here. And then also pocket 7s and 6s. It's not exactly a draw, but it's more like a protection type bet. And notice this is kind of tough, right? If we bet the flop using that strategy, and we'd like to bet the turn with some of our best hands, it makes it a little bit dicey to where we don't actually have very many draws, right? So this is a weird spot where things start to get a little bit funny because the opponent's range, once it goes check, is marginal. So you'd like to be bluffing, but we don't actually have a whole lot of bluffs. But we also don't have hands that could just very easily value bet either. So maybe the play here is to turn 4s and all the ace high spade draws and ace 5 and maybe even like 10-8 into a bluff, but that seems kind of unnecessary. So this is a scenario where you probably don't want to be doing a whole lot of betting, but you definitely do want to be betting your best hands at this point. So goes check. Suppose we check, opponent checks behind, river is an 8. Now, as played, we actually have 100%, we have a very, very wide, we have some combinations, there we go, I'm trying to get the words out of my mouth. We have some combinations of 8s, right? Because we check the flop, which we would always do, we check the turn, which we would always do, we arrive at the river, and here we are with our new trips. And these hands are really, really good. They're like, this is almost always the nuts. So when this is always the nuts, you get to make a big bet with the nuts and then with potential bluffs. So if we're going to use a pot size bet, we get to have roughly 2 premium made hands to 1 bluff, which is exactly what I have here, 10-5. And I think that is fine and reasonable. Should we be betting with ace jack and king jack? I think we actually could. I have no problem betting ace jack and king jack. Then we need to start finding more bluffs. Obviously, we could bluff pocket 4s, but when you bet pocket 4s, do you really think someone's folding a pair? I mean, not really. This is one of these scenarios where I could definitely get behind using the strategy I've outlined here, except for then turning pocket 4s into a bluff and then value betting ace jack and king jack using a small size. Because whenever you're value betting a marginal made hand, like ace jack and king jack, you typically do want to use small sizings, and you don't need very many bluffs. So here we would have, well, do the math real quick. How many ace jack and king jack do we have? We have 12 ace jacks, right? There's 3 jacks left and 4 aces left. 3 times 4 is 12. And we have 4 king jacks. So we have 24 of those to 6 pocket 4 bluffs that we could use for a small size. And the nice thing about that is that sometimes we're just going to be wrong about what our opponent's going to do, and they're going to call you with ace high or something, and you win with the pocket 4s. So that's that. If the turn goes bet called, we still bet ace jack for thin value on the turn. Well, I didn't bet ace jack on the turn, right? So I don't have that hand in my range. If I did bet ace jack on the turn, I would definitely not bet this river. If you bet the turn and your opponent calls, now presumably you don't have a whole lot of 8s in your range anymore, right? So now your hands like a jack become way, way worse. If you think about it, right? They become close to your worst made hand at that point. So if it's close to your worst made hand, you definitely do not want to be betting it if you did bet it. Why bet all of your backdoor flush draws on the flop? Out of necessity to some extent, because we wanted to find draws, right? All right. Ken says you've been doing marginal made to junk wrong this whole time. Well, that's not good. Notice here we actually have a lot of marginal made. You're always looking at percentages, right? Like right here, I said I want 2 premium mades to 1 busted draw. 2 to 1, 33 is 67%. And if you add these up, right, you have 15. 15 plus 8 equals 23. 15 divided by 23 equals 65-ish%, right? And you usually want at least 70% of your marginal made to junk range to be marginal made hands. Because when you check, you want to make sure you can continue against the bet. And notice here we are pretty well protected. So on the turn, we found ourselves in kind of a weird spot. But on the river, in this scenario, it works out pretty well. Notice though, if the river was a low card instead, or even a 9 or a 10 or a lot of cards, this would have worked out a little bit worse because now all of these 8s here, all these combinations would have been marginal made or junk, right? So we actually would end up with a lot of junk on some rivers. So it may look like this works out all the time, but it definitely does not work out all the time. So this is roughly how I would go about approaching this in game. And I think this is pretty logical. Like none of this seems absurd to me. Like if you've done enough homework challenges, you could probably figure out this answer. But I think a better answer, especially against good players, maybe to just check with everything. Okay? So now, okay. So now, let's take a look at this spot. So it goes check, check on the flop, but we check everything. So instead of getting to the turn with this range, you see we're missing the best hands. Now we're going to get to the turn with this range, which is just our whole range. So what I have us doing now is betting with our premium made hands, right? This is going to be king, jack, and better. I'm sorry, king, queen, and better. Then we're also going to be betting with the draws, which are all the obvious draws, the flush draws and open-ended straight draws and gut shot straight draws. 7-6 should be blue again, I apologize. And then we're checking a lot of marginal made hands, all of which are pretty decent. They can just call a turn bet a ton. You may say, why call ace-5 but not pocket sixes? That's because ace-5 has more outs to improve than pocket sixes, and they are roughly the same strength. Also, in this scenario, we can use a pretty big turn bet size, which is often the case, by the way. Whenever it does go check, check on the flop and you're out of position, usually the right bet size is going to be a big bet on the turn, like pot size bet. And that's because we are very polarized by having good made hands. As you see, king, queen, and better. Like king, queen's almost always good here. And then draws, right, that have plenty of equity. So this is a spot where we would get to bet very, very big if it goes check, check on the flop with the whole range. And then on the river, here we are. Notice now the river range looks a little bit different. And that's because we actually do now have a decent number of bluffs. All those backdoor ace high draws that did not come in on the flop, well, you know, the ones that did not have a heart draw, all of those are available now, giving us a lot of bluffing combinations, 15 of them. So we have 15 bluffs, which means we get to figure out how many value hands we can put into that range. Like, do we have enough of them? So all the eights obviously fit in. And then we could also use ace-jack, king-jack, queen-10, and queen-9. Those hands are probably good enough to value bet as well. So I'm usually going to go for a small bet in this scenario, or I'm going to split up the range and bet big with the 8 combinations, and then small with the queen and the king combinations plus some bluffs. And I think that play is perfectly fine and perfectly viable. When you do get to the river, very often you do want to be using 2 different bet sizes, just because if you do have a range that's not completely polarized on the river, like a jack is not the nuts, but it's probably good, and it can get called by worse, you're usually going to want to be using a small size with those hands, but a big size with the nut hands. If you think from just a straight GTO point of view, if you let the solver have infinite bet sizes, they would have the biggest bet size with hands that are the nuts, and it would have a tiny bet size with the hands that are barely good enough to value bet, just based on the way it works. So that's what I'm doing, and I think this just clearly works out nicely. The question is, do we get exploited on the flop by checking too often? And I think the answer is no, because notice if we had this natural breakdown and we check the flop, we get to call. Well, we're only folding 15% of the time, so we're calling way more than 70. And we may raise sometimes, to be fair, so we're going to check raise the flop sometimes too. So this is a scenario where our range is very well protected, which is nice. So protecting your range against loose, aggressive, battling opponents is definitely a good thing to do. Seems like a lot of junk. Why is A7 not in the draws? Well, because we needed... It's junk in that it can win at the showdown. It is worth mentioning here that we do have a little bit too much junk. This could easily be fixed, by the way, by just putting king-jack in the checking range, right? If you just add 12 more combinations to the green range, then we're good to go, right? So basically, Ace 7, we could have bluffed with it. The problem is that our betting range is starting to get a little bit too weak, I think. It's important to note that as you are as you are betting with a weaker range, you have to have fewer bluffs. So you can't just have the full ratio that you may be used to of 2-to-1. It has to go more like 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 or even 5-to-1, depending on how wide you are value betting. So anyway, either of these strategies I think is perfectly fine. Ace King is a marginal made hand. Why is that now? Well, think about it, right? If we check Ace King here and our opponent does bet, we realistically can call. I mean, pocket sevens could be marginal made. I want to make that clear. Ace King could be marginal made or junk. Sevens could be marginal made or junk. Sixes could be marginal made or junk. It's a little bit arbitrary here. Why was Ace King checked on the turn? In that scenario, because we had basically met our quota. Also, it helped protect our checking range because we needed more checking hands, right? In this scenario, we wanted to make sure we're at 70-30. We don't need any more draws. So this helps protect the ratio. So it's not... Stop looking at exactly a hand like Ace King and thinking, oh, I play Ace King a specific way. No, you play Ace King based on the way the rest of your range needs it to play. Like usually the nut hands are really easy and the junk hands are really easy. The draws and the marginal made hands are where you get to have a decent amount of wiggle room. Usually your premium hands are easy, right? So you like with your best hands, you just usually want to be betting. Not always, but usually. And with your absolute garbage hands, you usually want to be checking unless you have a huge range advantage. Mark says, how can you know when to get away from the 2-to-1 value bet to bluff? 2-to-1 value bet to bluff is when your range is perfectly polarized. Think about that. It doesn't happen very often. And you're betting the size of the pot. Okay? To be fair, I usually like over-bluffing a little bit just because I think people fold too often. But in this scenario, you want to ask, are there hands in this betting range that sometimes lose when I bet and get called? And the answer is obviously yes here because the jacks lose sometimes, right? So 24 out of your 49 hands in this range lose a real percentage of the time, 30, 40-ish percent of the time when you bet and get called. So knowing that means you have to have fewer than the 2-to-1 ratio. And as that number gets bigger and bigger, like you're making a very thin value bet, you very often want to be going for a very small size, which leads to you having very few bluffs in that range, right? When you use a small bet size, you're giving your opponent great odds. They should be calling a ton. Therefore, you want to use the small sizing there. So I hope that makes sense. Let's take a look at whatever the solver said. Solver said on the flop, Queen Jack 8. Notice solver likes check about 68% of the time. Like I said, it's somewhere between 50 and 100, right? And you see it's just using a really, really mixed strategy. And this is where this kind of thing gets really hard to implement, right? Which is why I made PokerCoaching.com, because I realize this type of strategy is really, really, really hard to implement. Let's take a look at the hands that the solver particularly likes to check. Particularly likes to check pocket sevens, pocket nines, pocket tens, pocket jacks. So slow play pocket jacks, that's fun. I guess that's not all the time anyway. Now, ace jack, king jack, it really likes to check, right? Marginal made hands, queen 10 it really likes to check, jack 10 it really likes to check. Let's make sure that's what we were doing. Pocket sevens, we're checking. Pocket tens and nines, we're checking. We're betting jacks, whatever. Ace jack, king jack, we're checking. Queen 10, queen 9, we're checking, right? You see, this is kind of how you go about checking your work, is seeing if the solver is doing... If like the hands that are betting very frequently, you're betting with, and the hands that are checking very frequently, you're checking with. Interestingly enough, it is betting 9-8 a decent chunk. But as you see, it's not actually betting any hand besides king 9 suited more than 50% of the time. And 10-9 more than 50% of the time. So king 9, 10-9, and ace 9 get bet, quote unquote, often. So let's take a look. Did we have king 9 as a bet? We did. Did we have ace 9 as a bet? We did. Did we have jack 10 as a bet? We did. So good. And I want to make this clear. I did not look at the solver before I did this answer. This is just how it naturally breaks down, usually, whenever you are going about doing this type of thing. Okay, so that's the flop. On the turn, now, when it goes check, check, remember how I said, with your best hands, you're usually going to want to be betting frequently and big. Take a look at this, right? There are 120% pot bet, over betting the pot. on the turn, it's overbetting 20% of the range and betting small with a decent chunk of the range. And this is because now when it goes check, check, we start to have a significant advantage with our made hands. So you see, it's going to be betting big with the draws, aces, king, the nut hands, aces, kings, queens, jacks, queen, jack, 10-9 if it has it. And then some draws, ace 10, king 10, right? That makes logical sense. Interesting is picking ace king to bet big. Did I do that? Or no, I just bet ace kings on the flop, so I didn't have as many ace kings in my range. But if you did have ace king, you might as well turn it into a bluff, right? And just keep going with it, because if you bet the flop and your opponent calls, get after it, I suppose. But as you see, again, this is very, very difficult to implement. One thing you do want to always look at, again, is which hands are like always bet. Aces are always bet if we have it. Ace queen is always bet if we have it. King queen is always bet if we have it. Right? The strong made hands are pretty much always betting. And then which hands are always checking or almost always checking? That's going to be ace 8, king 8, 10 8, 9 8, pocket nines. Let's make sure that lines up with what we had. Ace 8, king 8, pocket nines, right? All these hands are checking. So again, story checks out. On the river, interesting also, it's betting 3s and 2s and like 6s randomly sometimes, but not 7s. Right? Again, this kind of thing, I'm sure there's some rhyme or reason to why it's betting 6s sometimes, but not 7s. Why it's betting ace 5 all the time. I don't think I was betting ace 5 suited, so we're a little bit off there. Well, I know why. It's because it needs a little bit more protection, right? It's maybe the best hand, but it could use protection. I get the idea. And you'll find that like if you understand the GTO concepts, you can often figure out why the solver is doing something after the fact. But actually implementing it in game is pretty difficult, if not impossible. Then on the river, say we do get to the river by checking. Now it's going to use a big overbet or a tiny bet, right? Which makes sense. You're going to find that usually this medium-sized bet's not used all that often. So remember how I said, again, I have not really looked at this, but here we are. I said we're going to want to be betting big with our 8s, as you see. And it thinks ace, queen, and king queen can go big if we have it. Sure. I don't think we had ace, king, or queen, queen anymore. Did we? No, we didn't have ace, king, or king, queen. But the 8s were all going big. We didn't have it on that range either. But if I did, I would have been betting it. And then the that's the wrong tab. Then the medium bet sizes are going to be reserved for the king jack type hands, right? King jack, queen jack, not queen jack, I'm sorry. King jack, ace jack, jack 10 even goes for value, pocket 10s even goes for value. So pretty thin value here with those. So neat. Neat stuff. Notice the bluffs it chooses are ace 4, ace 3, ace 2, king 6 if it has it randomly, king 10 if it has it, ace 10 if it has it. Really just any potential bluff that it could possibly have, it's using at this point, which makes sense. Notice it's not picking pocket 7s as a bet, so maybe I was messing up a little bit there. Because I said I would not mind. Oh, did I? Where was I on the river? No, so I didn't have those on the river. Good. Oh, and when I did have them on the river, I checked them, so that's also good. It's always nice to check your work, and I think some of you like seeing what the solver does in these. If you don't like it, I guess skip that 5 minutes of it, but it's always good to check your work to make sure you're not doing anything just egregiously bad. And like I said, my default answer was continuation betting a little bit too much, but I don't have a problem with continuation betting a little bit too much because people play a little bit too straightforwardly. Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little. I hope you're enjoying this Thanksgiving Day marathon. I hope you just enjoyed going through one of my homework challenges. And I realize that these may seem a little bit in depth to you, but if you go back to the very earliest homework challenges at PokerCoaching.com, they will get you up to speed. There is a bit of a learning curve when it comes to thinking in terms of hand ranges. And that's why most people aren't very good at poker. They are thinking, how do I play my pocket jacks in this scenario? Or even if they start thinking about hand ranges pre-flop, by the time they get to the river, they're often completely lost. Like, for example, they'll say, well, my opponent could have the 7-4 suited that makes a straight, without realizing that they would, let's say, always bet 7-4 on the flop, or not even play 7-4 suited pre-flop, right? And it's important to understand how ranges interact and how to play your range accordingly, right? Because if you know how to play not just your hand, but your whole range, every time you study any specific scenario, it will go a long way to improving your skills because you learn how to play all the hands, which for most people, it's most enlightening to see how they play the bad hands because the bad hands, the marginal hands, right? All the hands here in green are the ones that often give players fits. And you learn how to balance a range. Being balanced is important. And once you know what a balanced strategy is, you can adjust to take advantage of whatever your opponents throw at you. So that is just one of the many benefits of PokerCoaching.com. We have over 40 challenge webinars, and I make a live webinar every single month where I go through and review some of the students' answers and discuss how I would play the scenario. And sometimes I discuss a few ways to play the scenario based on usually the opponent's tendencies. So that's all part of PokerCoaching.com. Head over right now to PokerCoaching.com/Black Friday to get an exclusive Black Friday discount.